good morning, good night, good afternoon, wherever we are, since we are worldwide. I'm excited to welcome you to the next occurrence of Resilience Reimagined, the Dean's our speaker series here of the Embry-Riddle Worldwide College of Arts and Sciences. I am Alexander Siedschlag, the Dean of the College, and our virtual speaker series, Resilience Reimagined, hosts esteemed guests once a month to discuss fresh perspective on a broad range of resilience topics, supporting our college's strategic vision to be a true destination college for multidisciplinary studies, looking at resilience from different lenses, and impactful collaborative research as we strive to transform our students and the broader community into responsive, responsible global citizens. And among other things, our college includes a department of security, disaster, and emergency services that has a natural connection to resilience. And I want to thank Julia Hoban, assistant professor in that, Tanya Track, assistant professor in that department and chair of our online Masters of Science in Human Security and Resilience, for recommending Sweta Baniya as today's speaker. So Sweta, with that, welcome to you. Let me briefly introduce you. Sweta Baniya is an assistant professor of rhetoric and professional and technical writing. We also have a department of humanities and communication here with the great virtual communication lab and writing center. So, but this is about Sweta here, not about us. So, but she is an assistant professor of rhetoric and professional and technical writing and an affiliate faculty of women and gender studies at Virginia Polytech Institute and State University. Through a transnational and non-Western perspective, Sweta's research focuses on transnational coalitions in disaster response, crisis communication, and non-Western rhetoric. Her most recently published book, Transnational Assemblages, Social Justice and Crisis Communication During Disaster, which is also the topic of her presentation today. So her book explores transnational activism in the April 2015 Nepal earthquake and the 2017 Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. Her scholarship has appeared in outlets such as the Technical Communications Quarterly, Technical Communications Enculturation, Journal of Business and Technical Communication, and Journal of Technological Studies, among others. So we are excited to have a guest speaker from Virginia Tech today. So with that, please take it away. We are so much looking forward to your presentation. And those attending online, as always, you know, if you care, during the presentation, you may leave your questions in the chat, or we also, as always, will set aside a couple of minutes towards the end for live Q&A, whatever you prefer. So, Sweta, all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean, for introducing me, and thank you so much, Dr. Julia Hoban, for giving me this opportunity and inviting me to your campus for Resilience Reimagined series. I'm going to share my slides, and just a trigger warning, I'm going to play a voice note that might have mention of death and other stuff. So can everybody see my screen?
Okay. Yes. Good morning. This is supposed to be 8 a.m. news bulletin. However, due to unthinkable earthquake, we have come up with this special bulletin. The total death toll of the unthinkable earthquake that struck Nepal on Saturday has reached 2,847.
So that voice note was me broadcasting a news from Radio Nepal, Nepal's national news agency, one of the Nepal's national news organizations, in 2015 during Nepal earthquake. So I remember when I was broadcasting this news, the ground below me was shaking, and even though I was experiencing the earthquake, I was still doing the job as a journalist. So that kind of background shaped my trajectory towards coming to the US, getting my PhD, and working on this book as a PhD dissertation, but now it has come out as a book. I'm going to put my book on the link on the chat as well. So this is the topic of today's presentation. So I'm going to talk about my book, which has just been published, and it is open access and available to everybody. So if you want to scan the QR code or click on the link that I just shared, you can download this for free and read it. And potentially, if you think it fits to your program, assign it in your classes. So for today, I'm going to talk about my book, a brief overview of what the book is about, some theories that kind of helped that I have used in this book to understand the complex communication disaster response systems, the methodologies that I've used in the book, and some results and implications. So I'm in the field of technical communication, and I'm kind of, thinking about how technical communicators can support communities during disaster to reimagine resilience. So to address the complexities of the world created by environmental hazards, my book, which I consider as an applied research project, has attempted to develop transnationally applicable and technologically advanced communication strategies that are grounded in social justice and community engagement to responding to a crisis. And my premise, or like this is a well-known fact, that any single entity of a nation, governments, even though however powerful they are or however much money they have, cannot solve the problems that are created by the disaster by themselves. So I just wanted to share that. So in that regard, when I started this project back in 2016, I had like fresh memory of earthquake. I just played a voice note regarding that, regarding my experience of the earthquake. So I had like very fresh memories of Nepal earthquake during that time, and it could not escape my mind. And when I came to the US in 2016, 2017, we had Hurricane Maria that also had created similar havoc in Puerto Rico. And when I was observing all these online activism information and everything, it just continued to remind me of what I had experienced in Nepal during Nepal earthquake. So that is how I decided to do this comparative study of how, similarly excluded and marginalized population actually respond to disaster in their own respective countries. So that's kind of the premise of this research. So in April 25, 2015, and this April, it will be around 10 years. So almost 9 years ago, Nepal earthquake had happened with 7.5 magnitude, and it created havoc in 14 different districts, and more than 8,000 people were died during that time, and more than 22,000 were injured. I know, like it's almost 9 years, but we can still see the ripple effects of how this disaster, compounded by COVID-19 and other like disasters that continue to happen, still like creates difficulties for a lot of marginalized communities in Nepal to survive. And when we think of Hurricane Maria in 2017, it was a Category 5 hurricane. The estimated death toll for this disaster was 800 to 8,000. The government created certain number of announced certain number of deaths, and a lot of people in Puerto Rico protested that number, and they created this committee to actually analyze and find out how many deaths, and it was revised to around 4,000 or 4 to 6,000, and it did create a lot of damage in Puerto Rico. And every year in some ways, Puerto Rico continues to suffer through a lot of disasters, and due to the due to like the relationship with the US, which is always very complicated, the emergency relief and every decision regarding Puerto Rico, even though there is a lot of damage and that's happening, it's always slowed. And it has been like that for a long time. So given these two disasters, I decided to do this comparative study of how a marginalized space like Nepal and how a colonized space like Puerto Rico, how people in these spaces respond to bigger crises that were of catastrophic nature. When I came across this theory, assemblage theory, developed by Deleuze and Guattari in France, I kind of kept on thinking about how people, come together during disaster, how disaster, even though it brings disruption, it promotes or prompts a response in the form of assemblages where people from different parts of the world or within the community interact, talk with each other, used a lot of different technologies that are available online and also offline medium, and come together to respond to any kind of crisis. So I have used assemblage theory in this book, but I'm not using this theory as a cookie cutter theory that kind of like, okay, these are the frameworks that has been developed by these people and I'm applying to these contexts. So that is something I've refrained and have kind of transpired to something called Transnational Assemblages, which is also the title of my book. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but I wanted to give a brief overview of what assemblage theory is. DeLanda, another scholar who talks a lot about assemblage theory, describes an assemblage as a multiplicity made of like heterogeneous terms, which establishes links and relationship across people of different ranges and different natures. So there are two concepts that assemblage theory kind of talks about. Territorializing, which is kind of creating new spaces. When disaster happens, people come together and create, either it is online or even if it is offline, they try to gather together within certain space to create some response mechanism. It could be thinking about partnerships with government, partnerships with nonprofit organizations, or just volunteers coming together to occupy some space or create their own territory. And it kind of like, I also kind of refrain using this territorializations rather than I want to use words such as creating communities and developing relationships and partnerships. They also talk about deterritorializing. So in the process of, occupying or creating new spaces, sometimes when disaster happen, everybody kind of come together. And as the immediate effects of disaster kind of comes to calm down, we can see like how people move out of these communities, either to like create another one or just move out of partnerships, creating their own organizations, or moving out of it so that they don't want to do those kind of work. So this is something that we also see in during the peak of disasters. So there is now I'm going to talk about affect in assemblages. So affect, we respond very affectively. Affect is something we cannot kind of describe in the form of words. It's a certain kind of like emotions or a reaction or interaction that kind of, when disaster happens, people are motivated affectively to respond to any kind of crisis, be it like, talking about that, sharing stories online, sharing the narratives, sharing our endorsement or rejections, or in different forms. So in the context of disaster or any kind of political crisis, affect plays a prominent role in kind of bringing this community of people together to create different types of assemblages. And that those assemblages could be like disaster responders, information providers, volunteers, or journalists, or even like in the larger context, various international organizations that can create their own network of responding to any disasters. So I mentioned earlier, I'm not using this theory as a cookie cutter theory to kind of like, this is what my data kind of talked about, which resembles this theory. That's something that I don't want to do. That is why I kind of developed this idea of transnational assemblages and what could that be in the context of, I'm kind of analyzing two different marginalized space, one from where I am, one completely different, or geographically, physically, and language-wise different space. So I developed this theory with, like, I call it transnational assemblages. And in the context of disaster, I define it as a coalition space or networks of people, organizations, or entities who are connected via online or offline mediums through objects like phones, computers, Google Docs, across the border, that brings all the people together to respond to any specific kind of natural or political crisis. So I want to pause a little bit here to discuss about how disaster has been discussed from, various aspects and various disciplines. So liberal arts, even within liberal arts, communications, political science, arts and performance, environmental studies, they discuss disaster in a variety of different ways. Engineering has their own, ideas of assessment, prediction, buildings, and there are practitioners who actually work in the community, or nonprofit activists who kind of work in the community during any disaster. There are a lot of other industry partners such as government or technology or startups or various types of big platforms like Facebook, Twitter. They have their own ways of responding to disasters. So I kind of when I was doing this research, I knew disaster is something that has been discussed by various disciplines, but to see actually how various disciplines kind of talk about disaster and what can I do to fulfill that gap by bringing all of these complex, disciplinary ideas together. This is something that I've attempted in the book as well, and thinking of professional and technical communication, where we deal with some technical ideas and kind of transferring that into something that people can actually can actually understand. I thought that could be a bigger platform where everything can come together. That's how, like, with those grounding and trying to attempt to fulfill that gap of like bringing everybody together, which is still a complex task. And I don't think, I think it will take a couple of more books for me to kind of actually do that work, but I have started that conversation. So for specific to this book and research, I had like three major questions of how did transnational assemblages of official and unofficial communities in Nepal and Puerto Rico came together to mitigate challenges of these two different disasters. What are the unique digital, rhetorical, and participatory action of assemblages in Nepal and Puerto Rico that helped in performing crisis communications transnationally? And what are the non-Western, which I specifically talk about Nepal when I say non-Western, and decolonized, that is Puerto Rico, and Western practices? What are the other, other countries' practices of knowledge making during disaster that we can explore to compose and communicate better to help vulnerable populations in need? So those were my kind of research questions, but there were some ethical concerns as well as, questions that I had. And this is something that I constantly think about even now. How can I do an unbiased research of my own community, which is Nepal, when I compare to a community that I'm not part of, which is Puerto Rico? And how can I, think about bridging this gap between Western and non-Western theoretical and methodological practices? And I am somebody who has, I got my PhD in the West, in the US, and with this grounding knowledge and information of non-Western theoretical and methodological practices that I have gathered as a practitioner in Nepal, as a journalist in Nepal. So kind of thinking about that also kind of shaped some ideas for this book. So to answer these questions, I have used a mixed methods study, mixed methods research approach of both quantitative and qualitative approaches. So for qualitative data collection, I gathered narratives and stories of survivors as well as volunteers, practitioners of these two different disasters. And for the quantitative data collection, I gathered formerly formerly Twitter, now X, Twitter data from Nepal and Puerto Rico, 7 days worth of data of all the tweets that were tweeted during that time of the disaster. So this is what I kind of like thought about. Mixed method study would be a great choice for answering these questions, because I was trying to think about multiple disciplines kind of coming together. So for narrative inquiry, I had, which is one of the qualitative ways of conducting the study. So for this, I had 30 participants, 15 from Nepal, 15 from Puerto Rico, who participated in this study, out of which 14 were women and 16 were men. And participants represented government, nonprofit organizations, media, local people, activists, and various volunteers. So with the purpose of like gathering stories and experiences of these people, I wanted to highlight their individual experiences and their lived not just individual experience, but the lived experiences of navigating this disaster, of responding to this crisis, and also trying to explore the contextual idea of situating them within the community and making their voice more prominent and powerful. So when I was trying to interview them, I did have certain questions, but I kind of wanted those questions to be just like writing questions, rather than prompting and asking them tell me this answer to this question or that question. I wanted to create a space with the communities and with people, and they will tell their stories. I'll share my experiences from Nepal earthquake. We had this space for sharing all these experiences of disaster response in different ways. And sometimes we would even there is a various different times that I have cried with the participants, and kind of it blurs this boundary of researcher and participant, and after all, we all are humans. So there are some on this slide, I have some quotations from different participants of what they were doing and how they were using technologies, how they created various platforms for a disaster response. I used in vivo for qualitative data coding. This is just an example of that. And there are some sample codings, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. For social network analysis, so what I wanted to do was I wanted to analyze large sets of data that were from Twitter, currently X. I'm going to use Twitter because that's what I'm familiar with. So I purchased large sets of data from nip.com, which is a sister organization of Twitter. And I kind of focused on gathering tweets from people who were government, local people in disaster area. People were tweeting about these two specific disasters. And I had some pulled out some hashtags that are displayed on this slide that were very prominent during both disasters. So I could not gather a month-long data because it was too expensive, and I was a graduate student during that time. And that is why I wasn't able to gather a large set of data, so that I kind of had to limit to 7 days worth of data during that time. So I was able to, again, with help of my, university, I was able to do that, collect that data. So for the social network analysis, I wanted to understand whether or not people and individual actors from all these countries were talking about or responding to the disaster. So that was the main purpose, whether or not transnational links were made. And this is a result from social network analysis of Twitter data. So in this figure, the larger, the colored nodes, the continents, and the larger nodes and nodes are the bigger countries. So purple here is the US, and light blue is Great Britain or the UK, and red represents Nepal, India cluster. So you can see that there is a cluster being formed, a triangle, almost like a triangle within these three countries. So that means that there are a lot of people who responded to these crises from these countries. And this kind of like might have happened due to like long-standing relationship of UK and United States to Nepal, a lot of diaspora and immigrants from Nepal to these specific countries, and also like the historical relationship. And there is also, we can see a thinner line between Australia, US, and Nepal as well. But overall, you can see how all across the world, there were some tweets tweeted within the 7 days of Nepal earthquake. And there were people like kind of like trying to talk about this particular issue. Whereas this is the social network analysis from Puerto Rico data. So altogether, I had around 60 million tweets from both of these disasters, 53 to 60 million tweets. And you can see when we see to Puerto Rico, there is not so much cluster being formed. There are still like tweets tweeted from all across the world. We can see there is a direct link between US and UK, or Puerto Rico and UK in this context, but there is not so much of a cluster that we can visibly see during this specific disaster. So that might be because one of the thing, electricity was a problem during Puerto Rico, but also, Puerto Rico being a colony of the US, and not being able to receive a lot of aid. In case of Nepal received aid from all over the world. But for the case of Puerto Rico, it was very difficult because there were a lot of protocols that needed to be followed. And, maybe because of that, there was less attention, but nevertheless, there were we can see the transnational connections being made in these two disasters. A book has more like specific details of each disaster, but in overall, some analytical results that I came up with was there was this rhetorical agency for global synergy via transnational assemblages created, by using various types of tools, by connecting with people. There is knowledge making during any kind of environmental risk by using various digital communication practices. There were a lot of digital technology mediated ecological literacies and public actions that happened. So for the formation of transnational assemblages during these both disasters were very successful due to network public performances. And you can see like people were either tweeting or sharing resources using various types of technologies, and they were creating these assemblages to respond to crisis. There was a lot of knowledge making that happened during this disaster. Government, media, people, nonprofit organization, all of them kind of came together. And I kind of argue that during any kind of disaster, the official and unofficial assemblages kind of interact, intersect, and cooperate with each other. And the boundary between official and unofficial kind of gets a little bit blurry. This is an example of the use of Google Docs in Nepal earthquake, where people, there were a specific group of people who were using Google Docs and putting all the information in Google Doc and constantly updating this overnight. And for technology mediated public action, a lot of people were also using Twitter, now X, formerly Twitter, to kind of raise voices about their own communities. And in one of the tweets, we can see there is a request to Viber, which is almost like a WhatsApp, calling and communicating services. And with that, like Viber kind of, enabled free calls for Nepal. And in this other tweet, we can see And this is from Puerto Rico. We can see how a person was sharing the information about this specific rural community. And I was able to interview one of them here. And, you know, with that tweet, a lot of attention was brought to that particular community. So, you know, this is something that I found also in my research was a role of women in disaster management. Kind of, you know, a lot of time women were excluded from the narrative of disaster management. I found that, you know, a lot of women activists, disaster managers, technical communicators in both Nepal earthquake and Hurricane Maria had a greater role, but their stories, rhetorical agencies are less represented and highlighted. So this was kind of like a different kind of, you know, discovery for which kind of shaped my second book project, where I have like only conducted interviews with women and how did they respond to COVID-19. So this brings to me like almost conclusion of this book, where I think about what could be social justice oriented technical communication in global disaster management. How can we kind of think about thinking about marginalized communities during disaster? How to incorporate advocacy-based communication, advocacy-based disaster response to support the communities in the need, you know, how can we bring together community voices in disaster response. And I think like this kind of like ties to the theme also of reimagining resilience. And how do we, I think like, you know, incorporation of social justice and ideas of like challenging oppressive systems and injustices that happen during disaster is very important to reimagine resilience as well. And, you know, I think like a lot of these disaster continues to remind us and unravels the already existing system of operations and how they operate, and how, you know, the more vulnerable and the more marginalized are the most vulnerable in these crises that happen. So that brings to me to thinking about how do we reimagine disaster response. And, you know, like we need to understand and honor the importance of transnational networks that have, you know, that kind of work in local communities to address complex issues and created by the disaster. We need to establish strong mechanisms with, you know, various types of transnational assemblages or network communities with it that kind of operate in an unofficial capacity during, or even sometimes official capacity during these disasters. Technical communicators in my field should value the local knowledges and experts, as well as, you know, provide platform for women and LGBTQIA plus community members in disaster response. And we do need to, I think, develop this stronger partnership with engineers, developers, community members, and community communication practitioners as well. So that kind of like brings me to almost a conclusion, like global issues of human development, health, and risk. Resilience should be tackled by building the communities. We need interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary networks, and recognize that we are trying to solve complex situation and we can do that together. And also like our research engagement needs to tackle social problems and ask like difficult disciplinary questions that kind of, you know, helps us to navigate this world where we continue to face disasters. Disaster is inevitable, but I think we can fight it together. And yeah, thank you so much. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Sweta. That has been fascinating and eye-opening, and in particular, as we have related, you know, fields of expertise and also academic offerings in our program. So in our colleges, and in particular, College of Arts and Sciences. So thank you so much for presenting the book and also pointing out that it is open access. Thank you for making it open access, and then also from the US point of view, you know, the non-traditional perspective that and the particular as you coined it, non-Western experience that you bring to the table is very important, in particular here in the US and for a worldwide campus of an aeronautical university where we really, like I said, strive to educate world citizens. World citizens have the sustainable development goals in mind, but also if we only look at the US, their home, but your work really adds meaning and impetus to the whole community approach in emergency management and disaster response. So thank you for all that you are doing. And with that, the floor is open for questions. I did not, other than applause, I did not see any questions in the chat. But if there are any questions, and I'm sure there are, who would like to go first? So you can either speak up or type up, and leave your question or your comment in the chat. So Janice, you shared some links from Puerto Rico, from local news about Hurricane Maria. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you so much. I think I see a question. Yeah.
Oh, there is one, right, from Alex Reister. And Alex is in our Department of Humanities and Communication, as well as the chair for our Bachelor in Communication that now also includes a track in Crisis, Risk, and Resilience Communication. So maybe I can read out Alex's question. Would you be able to elaborate on your future research and what else you hope to achieve in the future?
Thank you so much. That is a great question. So at the end of the slide, I talked about women disaster responders and them not having a space. So my second book project, which is under contract with Ohio State University Press, it specifically looks at COVID-19, how women in Nepal, Puerto Rico, and Trinidad and Tobago responded to COVID-19. And I specifically, for this project, interviewed women disaster responders who are the leaders of various nonprofits in these countries, as well as like volunteers who are specifically women. So I wanted to know what is women's perspective on this disaster. So it was very fascinating for me to find that, there is a lot of intersectionality and intersectional disaster response already happening on the ground and in these specific countries. So one of the findings of that, this particular, the second project is like, how do we make information to action? How do we create advocacy-based communication, and how do we reimagine disaster response from intersectional point of view? So I think like my future research is like constantly thinking about how do we incorporate intersectionality, social justice in reimagining what disaster response and crisis communication could be like. And I think that is what I'm constantly doing. The second thing I am thinking, and this is in my book, I talk a little bit about what disaster rhetoric is, or rhetoric of disaster. And I had like touched upon only, there's so much one can do in their first book, so forgive me for that. But I have touched upon what disaster rhetorics can be. And I think in my this is something that I'm constantly kind of thinking and researching and trying to expand. What is disaster rhetorics? What are the components of disaster rhetorics, and how understanding disaster rhetorics from this multisectoral point of view will help us respond to disaster in a more meaningful way. So that's something that I'm doing. And then the third kind of idea, which is still in the process of idea, is the incorporation of AI. And I know everybody's talking about AI, so I am also thinking about how can AI, if we use AI in crisis communication, how do we do that ethically? And how do we do that so that we empower communicators during disaster response? So those are like three different things that I'm thinking of my future research. Thank you so much. And thank you for this comment on the slide as well.
Nice. And then thank you. And Kat left an affirmative comment. So very important. Multi-jurisdictional response challenges. Obviously, that connects the work that you've been doing with, and then also intercultural and cross-cultural collaborative responses with the assemblages you have been studying. Another question from Janice Amos, who is in our Department of Humanities and Communication. Do you ever worry about misinformation being communicated?
Of course. Of course. And even during Nepal earthquake and Hurricane Maria, there were a lot of misinformation about who needs what aid, who has, which community needs more was miscommunicated. And there was a lot of stress about the number of death counts and, government hiding the number of death counts, which actually happened in Puerto Rico. But we have seen, and all of us quite know, during COVID, the misinformation just like rose quite a bit. And, the WHO kind of created this term infodemic. Also within that context of misinformation, I do worry quite a bit about misinformation, and how do we actually tackle that? And this happens also, the power of misinformation is quite a bit during kind of any kind of disaster, because it kind of changes people's perspective, and it can, it can also, like, information can save lives, but misinformation will also help to like lose lives. And that actually happened during COVID-19 quite a bit. And I talked about my second book project, and one of my participants mentioned that a lot of Nepali migrant workers who who caught COVID, some of them, and this is very sad, some of them had to, didn't want to come back to home and thought that they were eventually going to die. So they ended up committing suicide. So the, misinformation is very, very bad. And I actually worry quite a bit about that. And we discussed this quite a bit in our class. And I think there are various ways we can tackle misinformation, and it is from our how can we, and I think that ties to this idea of advocacy-based communication. How do we incorporate that to challenge something like misinformation? How do we empower communities to understand what is information and what is misinformation? What are the tools that we can provide to people to be able to understand what is information, what is not? So I think, yeah, thank you so much for that question.
Very important.
I can go with the question.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. And I have two questions. My first one is on your research, which is so fascinating, on your research methods, and it's community-based research. So I'm curious what challenges, yes, you encountered doing this work, and for others who want to do community-based research, what would be your recommendations or lessons learned? And related to that, again, doing transcultural research is another challenge, and especially you having Nepalese background, yes, how you communicated that, and then doing research in Puerto Rico with much more distant culture for you. So how you navigated these challenges? And again, asking for myself, as I also often struggle with this. So I'm curious your insights on that.
Thank you so much for that question. Definitely, I think my research is also, as you pointed out, it's community-based research. And the challenge is that I kind of, there were a lot of different challenges. And I think the first challenge is getting this IRB approval and trying to, and because Nepal does not have IRB system already in place, so it was very difficult to convince people here that I'm doing ethical research. So that was one of the institutional challenges. But the other, I think, like, the main advice I can give is developing this relationship with the community is one of the most important things that I've learned. And we are not, I always present myself as like, I'm doing this research for you, and you are, you are the experts, I'm not the expert. So that's kind of like how I present myself, and always giving the clarity that whatever I write, I'll share this with you before it gets published. So that's what I've done in my first book as well as the second book. And I know like all the one thing, because all these organizations and people have very actively worked during any kind of disaster, they are also at the verge of being burnt out. And we are asking more time for them to talk, and we're asking their time and energy to invest. And I think like that is one of the challenges. How do you respect their time? How do you make sure that whatever time that they give is valuable? And kind of like when I was a graduate student, I was not able to compensate any of the participants because I didn't have that kind of money and funding. But now I think of their time as very valuable, and I would like to get, whenever I do this kind of research and community-based research, I would like to have them compensated. And again, I go back to like developing these relationships. And in Nepal, it was easier. But also, even though I had like this community of people, nobody would respond email. So nobody will respond their email, but I would, if I reach out to them informally, on Facebook or on Twitter with like formal language, still like formal language that I had shared with IRB, they would respond. So that was one of the challenges, trying to get participants to not using formal means of communication, but some informal. And for Puerto Rico, it was also like language barrier was there. And since I did not have any networks already in existence, it was a little bit difficult. Luckily, I had colleagues within my rhetoric discipline, some of them who linked me with somebody and kind of snowballed that. But most of the times I would either reach out to various informal organization or informal groups on Facebook, informal groups on Twitter. And if there are formal groups, formal organizations, I would call them. And I know it was hard to speak with them, not being able to speak in English and me not being able to speak in Spanish, but we would talk a little bit in different ways, that I had emailed you in this way. And that kind of comes to me because of being a journalist, where I would like actually pick up the phone and call them and talk about, and this were all approved by IRB, of course, and try to like talk about that. And that kind of like me calling them, trying to, following up with email, helped me establish certain kind of relationship with them. And when I actually went there to interview them, I had already, talked with them on phone, and have emailed and had set up a time. So it kind of helped that I have done all these other homework about them. So it helped me when we met there. It was again, and also the narrative inquiry approach, where I was not kind of like, this is the interview I'm doing, and creating that space and giving them platform for me to hear their stories and representing that story well, and giving them that confidence that whatever I'm researching will be represented in a specific way, and they will have access to this. That is why I really wanted to make my book open access, so that people who cannot buy it, and all the people who have contributed their stories will be online. So those are like some of the ways I think. Yeah, and the challenges, of course, language barrier was a challenge in Puerto Rico. I had to use translator during like very specific interviews, because people were not comfortable in speaking in English. And but that was good enough. And yeah, that's kind of how it kind of helped. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. Very insightful.
So once again, then I would like to take the opportunity to thank you, Sweta, for presenting. That really has been very, very insightful and informative. And thanks all for coming. But before you leave, if you don't know a lot about our College of Arts and Sciences here yet and would like to know more, please feel free to check the link that I posted. And top right, you're also able to follow us on social media to automatically in the future, be informed about opportunities and events like that. So thanks again, everybody. Thank you, Sweta. Congratulations on your book. I know there will be a lot more to come. Look at me. So it develops over time, but that's a wonderful starter. So thank you so much for sharing, and be safe, be good, and I hope to see you around very soon again. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you everybody for coming here. And yeah, thank you, Yulia, for arranging this.